just beginning with paragraph 20, Thucydides says the following: "These, then, are my findings about early history, though it is difficult to be sure of every detail in the evidence, since people accept quite uncritically any reports of the past they get from others, even those relating to their own country. The great majority of Athenians, for example, think that Hipparchus was tyrant when he was killed by Harmodius and Aristogeiton, and they're unaware that Hippias, as the oldest of the sons of Pisistratus, was the ruler, while Hipparchus and Thessalus were his younger brothers. In fact, on the very day in question, indeed right at the last minute, Harmonius and Aristogeiton suspected that Hippias had been told something by one of their fellow conspirators, and believing him to be forewarned, held back from him. But since they were still willing to risk their lives and achieving something before being arrested, when they ran into Hipparchus by the shrine called Leocorium while he was organizing the Pan-Athenaic procession, they killed him. The other Greeks, too, have many other mistaken beliefs about matters that are current now, as well as those from the dim and distant past, such as thinking that the Spartan kings each cast not one but two votes, and that they have a special pitonate unit of troops, which never actually existed. So little trouble do people take to search out the truth, and so readily do they accept what first comes to hand." All right, now that entire paragraph is extremely important, but it's admittedly complicated. But just to begin with the last sentence there, it's a conclusion that he's making from everything he has said previously in that paragraph. And notice that it's a claim to human nature. And so just to repeat it, so little trouble do people take to search out the truth, and so readily do they accept what first comes to hand. Now, I'm personally a fan of the Hobbes translation, and the way that Hobbes translates the Greek right here is that he says, "So impatient of labor are most men in search of truth, and they embrace soonest the things that are next to hand." And again, to emphasize, that's a deduction or a conclusion from everything that's been said previously in the paragraph. And I'll explain how, but it's important for us to realize that is a claim about human nature. And so it may very well be the case that the opening sentence to Aristotle's Metaphysics is true, namely, that all men by nature stretch themselves out towards learning. It could also, in fact, be true that just because all men stretch themselves out towards learning, in stretching themselves out towards learning, they become very impatient and simply lazy very quickly. And let me lastly point out something that is extremely important. The deduction or the conclusion that Thucydides is making there regarding man's laziness towards the truth and simply accepting whatever is closest at hand. And the Greek word there is etoima and means at hand or ready or prepared. And so while it's a figure of speech and one that we still recognize in our own language, it's going to turn out that this means everything for Heidegger with regard to everything that comes tumbling out of his inquiry into art and nature, which is to say being itself, and in particular for our purposes in this series, Heidegger's teaching on technology as a question. And so that figure of speech of simply accepting as true that which is closest at hand or ready or prepared carries more significance than we can possibly imagine right now. But the important fact is that it's here and in a very significant way. So we underscore and we highlight it right now so that we don't lose sight of it and everything going forward until we get to Heidegger. But be that as it may, what Thucydides is telling us here is that he is not one of those people, and the reader that he wants is also not one of those people. But in order to properly understand politics, and especially the extreme, which is to say war, you have to know the nature of man so that your governance of man corresponds with his nature. And one way that I like to phrase this is to say that to expect more of reason than reason itself is capable of in politics is itself unreasonable. And that's going to be a point of commonality between Thucydides and Plato and Aristotle, despite their enormous differences on other fundamentals. But okay, how does Thucydides deduce that from the paragraph? Setting aside all the names for a moment, what Thucydides is saying is that most Athenians don't even know the history of their own city. And what that means is that they don't know the history of their own, which is to say that which they should love the most, their people, their way of life, its origins. And it's even worse because what Thucydides is saying is that ignorance is willful precisely because they're lazy. The common understanding, which is to say the vulgar understanding, is that Hipparchus was the tyrant, and that the Athenians being liberated from the tyranny of the Pisistratus came about as a result of Harmodius and Aristogeiton murdering Hipparchus. And what Thucydides is claiming here is that no, Hipparchus was not the tyrant. In fact, it was Hippias who was the ruler. And okay, full stop. There are two things that have been claimed. The Athenians fundamentally don't recognize or sufficiently understand tyranny itself because they don't seem to understand that it was Hippias, not Hipparchus, who was the ruler, which is to say who was the tyrant. And second, they fail to recognize or understand what it was that actually freed them from the tyranny, because Hipparchus being murdered would change absolutely nothing if it's the case that Hippias was the ruler, which is to say the tyrant. And in fact, we can say it runs even deeper than that, because over the past few paragraphs, Thucydides has been pointing out the weaknesses of the ancient things and the poets in particular. And yet here, immediately at the conclusion of the archaeology, Thucydides doesn't use an ancient example. He uses a modern example. And so it turns out that the failure of judgment, which is to say the weakness that was going on with the ancient things, is still present. In other words, and even more provocatively, the weakness of the ancient Athenians is still the weakness of the modern Athenians. And the failure of the modern Athenians to even be able to recognize a tyrant, that's going to show itself again. And it's going to show itself with just about the most important person in all of Thucydides' text, namely Alcibiades, because the fear, the rumor about Alcibiades is that he was in favor of a return to the tyranny. And so the failure of the Athenians in their handling of Alcibiades is a direct result of their ongoing, their long-standing failure to recognize tyranny as such. And that opens the door to the question of what is the polis supposed to do with someone as capable in the art of politics as Alcibiades. And while that's a question that we're not going to be able to address in this discussion, it's at least extremely important that question, as a question, be on our horizon, because what it shows is how techne, or technology, extends beyond the mastery of the non-human motions for human purposes, such as the triremes over the ocean, and into the mastery of the human motions, which is to say the human passions, for the most significant human purposes, which is to say the most consequential human purposes. And this is what I've been pointing out all along regarding politics or statesmanship as an art. It's the art of the mastery of the human passions that are the very source of all the human motions. And so for our purposes here, the significance of paragraph 20 is that the ancient things have not been known, and they're still not known according to Thucydides. And that lack of knowledge is in fact going to show itself in the Peloponnesian War. And that's why Thucydides has used a modern example in his conclusion on the ancient things of the archaeology. And so now, continuing from that deduction at the end of paragraph 20 about the laziness of not just ancient man, but especially even modern man, which is to say the laziness of man in general, or man simply, Thucydides continues that thought in paragraph 21 as follows. From the evidence I have presented, however, one would not go wrong in supposing that events were very much as I have set them out, and no one should prefer rather to believe the songs of the poets who exaggerate things for artistic purposes, or the writings of the chroniclers, which are composed more to make good listening than to represent the truth, being impossible to check, and having most of them won a place over time in the imaginary realm of fable. My findings, however, you can regard as derived from the clearest evidence available for material of this antiquity. Now, just as a sidebar, there's a more literal way to translate that sentence, and what it reads as follows. From the stated evidences, nevertheless, someone would not go wrong by considering what I have recounted to be very much of that kind, in other words, reliable, not rather believing as the poets have sung with decorated exaggeration concerning these matters, or as the chroniclers, in a manner more attractive to hear than true, have composed things that are incapable of being disproved, and things that have, many of them in time, won their way into the fabulous in a way that cannot be believed. But one would not go wrong, considering what I have recounted, to have been researched from the clearest evidences, given that the manners are sufficiently ancient. And then Thucydides ends that paragraph with the following. And so back to this war, men always think that the war that they're engaged in at the moment is the greatest one ever. And then when it's over, they're more impressed by earlier ones. Nevertheless, for those who look at the facts, this war will prove to be greater than the earlier ones. All right, so what we need to recognize here in paragraph 21 is that Thucydides is distinguishing his activity from the activity of two other particular kinds of crafts, namely the poets and the chroniclers, which is to say the poetai and the logographoi. And it's because, as he says, the poets over-exaggerate things, whereas the chroniclers, or the logographoi, sacrifice truth, or at the very least, accuracy, in favor of pleasurable eloquence. And so what this means concerning the deduction or the conclusion that Thucydides has just drawn at the end of the previous paragraph regarding man's laziness towards the truth is that men prefer those things that are exaggerated and those things which are pleasurable to hear. And so what Thucydides is telling us is that his account of the Peloponnesian War is not going to be over-exaggerated, nor is it necessarily going to be pleasurable to hear. And another way to phrase this that is extremely helpful for where we're going in this series with Heidegger and the contemporary question of technology as a question is that man prefers that which is ready or present at hand more than he prefers the work required to discern the truth, precisely because that which is ready or present at hand is over-exaggerated and or simply more pleasurable. And so underline and highlight that because we absolutely are going to have to come back to that throughout this series on technology and nihilism time and time again. But just continuing, he ends paragraph 21 by pointing out that man's laziness also shows itself in thinking that all the things of the present moment are the greatest things ever. And only through hindsight do people look back upon previous things and think that the previous things might in fact have been better or greater in significance. In other words, this is an acknowledgement by Thucydides that the default position of man is to privilege the present to the past, or as we might otherwise say, the default of man is to believe that whatever is latest is greatest. And we see this always and especially regarding thought itself, which is to say that we tend to always privilege thinkers of the present over and against thinkers of the past. And that's really why I'm including Thucydides in our run-up in this series to the thought of the various 19th and 20th century thinkers like Nietzsche, Junger, Heidegger, Strauss, etc. And what Thucydides is saying about this is, look, bear with me, because I realize that is how most men are. But what I'm telling you is that the Peloponnesian War was, in fact, the greatest war prior to all the previous wars. And this leads us directly into the culmination of the entire archaeology and Thucydides' amazing statement about the rest of the way that he's going to conduct the inquiry into the Peloponnesian War, because he's about to tell us that not only is the Peloponnesian War greater than all the previous wars, but in fact, it is a possession for all time. And that speaks directly to that opening paragraph we discussed, where Thucydides' claim is that he has found a universal within the particular of the Peloponnesian War. And what's so amazing about it is that it's going to concern precisely that which we have not seen at all in the archaeology, namely what we would otherwise think of as Thucydides' literary style, which is to say the speeches that he's going to sprinkle the rest of the text with. And so just jumping into paragraph 22, this is what Thucydides says.